People always ask when my life changed. They expect me to say it happened the night Adrian Romano chose me. They're wrong. My life changed the second the room fell silent before I even knew his name. I believed I understood powerful people before that evening. Living in Manhattan teaches you that wealth has its own language. Expensive watches speak louder than words. Perfect smiles hide impossible expectations. Men in tailored suits tip generously when they're happy and forget your name when they're not. At 26, I had learned to move through their world without ever belonging to it. I worked mornings at an event planning company and picked up banquet shifts whenever rent reminded me that dreams were expensive. That Friday's charity gala at the Grand Lexington Hotel was supposed to be another long night of polished silver trays, rehearsed smiles, and aching feet. By midnight, I planned to be home with leftover takeout, my rescue cat Oliver curled beside me, and another rejection email from an architecture internship waiting unopened in my inbox. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Outside, rain tapped softly against the towering windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. The city lights blurred through the water like stars melting into the streets below. Inside, crystal chandeliers painted warm reflections across polished marble floors while a string quartet drifted through the ballroom with music elegant enough to make ordinary conversations sound important. I adjusted the sleeve of my black uniform for what felt like the 100th time and balanced a silver tray filled with sparkling water glasses. My manager believed confidence came from perfect posture. I suspected confidence came from never having overdue student loans. Around me, conversations floated through the air. Stock investments. Vacation homes in Aspen. Private schools. Political fundraisers. Entire lives measured by opportunities one had only ever read about. I smiled politely whenever someone looked my way, invisible in the familiar way service workers often become. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant nobody expected anything from me except a filled glass and perfect timing. Then a little girl, maybe 6 years old, wandered away from one of the donor tables chasing a white balloon that had slipped from her wrist. Her patent leather shoes squeaked against the marble as she giggled, completely unaware she was heading toward a waiter carrying a towering display of champagne flutes. My heart skipped. Before anyone else reacted, I set my tray onto a nearby table and hurried forward, catching the balloon's ribbon just before it floated beyond her reach. The child laughed as I placed it gently back into her small hand. "Thank you," she whispered with the kind of sincerity adults forget how to give. Her mother hurried over, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, apologizing repeatedly. "She's perfectly fine," I said with a smile. "Looks like she just wanted to explore." The woman thanked me again before guiding her daughter back through the crowd. I watched them disappear and reached for my tray. That's when I noticed something had changed. The music hadn't stopped. The conversations hadn't ended. But the atmosphere had shifted in a way I couldn't explain. Faces turned toward the ballroom entrance one after another, not out of curiosity, but instinct. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Even seasoned executives straightened their jackets as though preparing for an inspection. I followed their gaze. A tall man stepped through the open doors wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that seemed almost understated compared to everyone else's attempts at impressing the room. His dark hair was neatly brushed back. His expression revealed nothing. Yet somehow every person nearby adjusted themselves without being asked. He didn't demand attention. The room surrendered it willingly. I had never seen him before. I didn't know his name. I didn't know why my heartbeat suddenly felt louder than the orchestra. I only knew that for one impossible moment, his calm blue-gray eyes swept across hundreds of strangers, and stopped on me. I should have looked away. Every instinct I had built over years of navigating rooms that were never meant for people like me told me to lower my eyes, pick up my tray, and continue serving drinks. Instead, I looked back. His gaze was steady, almost impossibly calm, carrying none of the restless curiosity I was used to seeing from wealthy guests. It was the kind of look that measured everything without appearing to judge anything. Then someone beside me whispered so quietly that I almost missed it. "Mr. Romano is here." The name meant nothing to me. It clearly meant everything to everyone else. The hotel manager hurried across the ballroom with a smile that looked carefully rehearsed. Board members abandoned conversations mid-sentence. Even security guards seemed to stand a little straighter as they subtly repositioned themselves near the entrance. Adrian Romano acknowledged no one immediately. He walked at an unhurried pace, hands resting naturally at his sides, greeting a few familiar faces with brief nods instead of handshakes. He did not seem interested in impressing anyone. Somehow that made him more impressive than everyone else in the room combined. I picked up my tray again, reminding myself that important people attended charity galas every weekend in Manhattan. Whoever he was, he had nothing to do with me. I delivered sparkling water to a table near the center of the ballroom where several investors were discussing a hospital expansion project. One gentleman thanked me without looking up from his conversation. Another absent-mindedly slid his empty glass toward me while continuing to debate tax incentives. Familiar. Predictable. Safe. As I turned to leave, I noticed the little girl from earlier sitting quietly beside her mother, still holding the white balloon. She smiled the instant she recognized me and gave me a tiny wave. I smiled back before returning to work. That simple exchange settled my nerves more than it should have. Kindness always felt louder than luxury. A few minutes later, one of the senior coordinators hurried toward me with visible tension in her expression. "Emily, table 7 needs fresh coffee immediately. Personally. Do not keep them waiting." I nodded without asking questions. Table 7 sat near the ballroom windows overlooking Central Park. As I approached with the silver coffee service, I realized why everyone seemed unusually anxious. Adrian Romano occupied the seat facing the room. 4 other guests surrounded him, all dressed with the same quiet elegance that suggested influence rather than display. Their conversation stopped the moment I reached the table. "Fresh coffee?" I asked softly. One of the men nodded. "Please." My hands remained steady as I poured each cup carefully. Years of banquet work had taught me that competence often meant pretending you were not intimidated. I reached Adrian last. His cup was still half full. "Would you like a refill, sir?" For the first time since entering the ballroom, he spoke directly to me. "Only if it is still hot." His voice was low, calm, and unexpectedly warm. I glanced at the silver pot. "It is. I checked less than a minute ago." Something almost resembling amusement touched the corner of his mouth. "Then I trust your judgment." I filled his cup without spilling a single drop, although my heartbeat insisted I should have. As I placed the pot back onto the tray, one of the businessmen laughed lightly. "You are fortunate, Mississippi. Mr. Romano rarely trusts anyone's judgment." I assumed it was a joke and offered the polite smile expected from every hotel employee. Adrian said nothing. He simply looked at me again for one quiet second before returning his attention to the discussion. I walked away, convincing myself the strange moment was already over. I did not realize that from across the ballroom, more than one pair of curious eyes had noticed exactly where Adrian Romano had chosen to look. The rest of the evening should have settled into the familiar rhythm of polished smiles and quiet efficiency, but something invisible had shifted the moment I walked away from table 7. I could feel it without understanding it, the same way you feel the air change before a summer storm reaches the city. My manager, Linda, suddenly became unusually attentive, checking every tray before I carried it into the ballroom and reminding me twice to be careful around the VIP guests. She had never done that before. "Emily," she whispered as she straightened the cuff of my uniform, "whatever happens tonight, keep smiling. Important people remember good service." I almost laughed. In my experience, important people rarely remembered the people serving them at all. I picked up another tray, this one carrying delicate desserts decorated with fresh berries and edible gold leaf, and made my way through the growing crowd. The charity auction had just ended, and conversations had become louder, more relaxed. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers while waiters moved like clockwork between clusters of guests discussing donations, business partnerships, and vacation plans. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until I reached a group gathered near the ballroom's center fountain. One man stepped slightly into my path without looking where he was going. His tailored navy jacket brushed against my tray, sending one dessert plate sliding dangerously toward the edge. I caught it just before it fell. "I am so sorry," I said automatically. Before the man could answer, another voice spoke with a hint of amusement. "She almost saved your $1,000 shoes." Several people laughed politely. I looked up and found three well-dressed men watching the exchange. Judging by their expensive watches and effortless confidence, they belonged to the same world as everyone seated at the exclusive tables. One of them smiled, but there was something rehearsed about it that made me uncomfortable. "Fast reflexes," he said. "You should work somewhere more exciting than carrying cheesecake." I returned the practiced smile every banquet employee learns during training. "I enjoy my job, sir." "Do you?" another asked. "Or are you just saying that because your manager is watching?" They chuckled among themselves. The comments were not openly rude, but they carried the unmistakable tone of people entertaining themselves at someone else's expense. I shifted the tray slightly. "Excuse me. These desserts are getting cold." "Stay for a minute," the first man insisted with a grin. "We are making conversation." "I appreciate that," I replied carefully, "but the guests are waiting." For a brief second, the smiles around me faded. One of the men raised an eyebrow as though surprised I had politely refused to play along. "Confident," he murmured. "That is unusual." I simply nodded and started to step away. Before I could leave, the little girl with the white balloon ran past again, laughing as her father followed close behind. She nearly bumped into my tray, but this time I shifted my weight smoothly, protecting both the desserts and the child without spilling a thing. Her father smiled apologetically. "Thank you again." "Of course," I answered. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet when I looked back toward the three businessmen, none of them were watching me anymore. Their attention had shifted across the ballroom. I followed their line of sight without thinking. Adrian Romano remained seated near the windows, speaking quietly with one of his associates. He had not raised his voice. He had not stood up. Yet every one of those men suddenly straightened their posture as if reminded they were being observed. Adrian did not appear angry. He did not even appear interested. He simply looked in our direction for one calm, unreadable moment before returning to his conversation. Somehow, that was enough to change the entire mood around me. The ballroom slowly returned to its comfortable rhythm, but I could not shake the strange feeling that every ordinary moment now carried an invisible weight. I kept reminding myself that I was imagining things. Wealthy people looked at everyone without really seeing them. Whatever had happened near the fountain meant nothing. I focused on my work. Refill glasses. Collect empty plates. Smile. Repeat. It was almost 10 o'clock when Linda hurried toward me again, this time holding a small tablet against her chest. Her expression was tighter than before. "Emily, one of our private guests requested table service in the library lounge upstairs. Take this bottle of sparkling water and these coffee cups. Do not keep them waiting." I nodded, balancing the tray carefully as I slipped away from the music and laughter of the ballroom. The second floor felt like another world. The noise faded behind thick wooden doors, replaced by quiet conversations and the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Warm lamps illuminated shelves lined with leather-bound books that looked as though no one had opened them in years. The library lounge hosted only a handful of guests, all speaking in low voices around polished oak tables. As I approached the reserved corner, I recognized two of the businessmen who had teased me earlier. They noticed me immediately. "Well," one of them said with an easy smile, "our favorite waitress is back." I placed the tray on the table without reacting. "Fresh coffee and sparkling water." "Stay for a moment," another replied. "We were just discussing how difficult it must be to survive in New York these days." I poured the coffee quietly. "It keeps me busy." "Busy is one word for it." He leaned back comfortably. "Tell me, Emily, what does someone like you actually dream about? I paused for only a second. Finishing architecture school. Architecture? One of them laughed softly. Interesting choice. Another lifted his coffee cup. Do you really believe people from your background end up designing skyscrapers? His tone remained perfectly polite, which somehow made the question feel heavier. I met his eyes calmly. Someone designs every skyscraper. They all have to start somewhere. The table fell silent for a heartbeat. One man smiled into his cup while another exchanged a quick glance with his companion. The first speaker chuckled. You have confidence. No, I answered gently. I have plans. Before anyone could respond, Linda appeared in the doorway looking visibly nervous. She motioned for me to step outside. I excused myself and followed her into the hallway. Emily, she whispered urgently, what happened in there? Nothing. Those gentlemen specifically asked your name. I frowned. Why would that matter? Because they almost never notice the staff. She hesitated before adding, and someone else asked about you too. My stomach tightened. Who? Linda glanced toward the closed library doors as though afraid someone might overhear. Mr. Romano. For a second I thought I had misunderstood her. Why? He did not explain. She gave a nervous laugh that convinced neither of us. He only asked how long you had worked here and whether you were a permanent employee. My pulse quickened despite every effort to stay calm. None of it made sense. I had served him coffee. That was all. There had been dozens of waiters in the ballroom that evening. Hundreds of guests. Why would he remember me? Linda touched my arm gently. Whatever this is, just stay professional. I always do. She nodded, though her worried expression remained. As I returned toward the ballroom carrying the empty tray, I caught my reflection in one of the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked city. I looked exactly the same as I had 3 hours earlier. Same uniform. Same tired eyes. Same simple ponytail. Yet somewhere inside that hotel, a man whose name could quiet an entire room had asked a question about me, and for reasons I could not begin to understand, I had the unmistakable feeling that the ordinary life I had been protecting all these years was beginning to slip quietly out of my hands. The rain outside had become steadier, tracing silver lines across the enormous windows while the city shimmered beneath a blanket of reflected lights. Midnight was still an hour away. I told myself that if I could make it through 60 more minutes, I could go home, feed Oliver, wash the perfume and polished smiles from my skin, and forget that Adrian Romano had ever learned my name. That plan lasted exactly 12 minutes. Linda intercepted me before I reached the service station. Emily, I need you in the East Ballroom. Her voice sounded unusually strained. There was a seating change for the private reception. I nodded and followed her through a pair of tall walnut doors into a smaller ballroom reserved for the event's largest donors. The room was quieter than the main gala but somehow carried even more influence. Governors, business leaders, philanthropists, and executives stood in small circles beneath glittering chandeliers, speaking softly over jazz music drifting from a grand piano. Every table was arranged with impossible precision. Crystal glasses reflected warm candlelight across white linen. It felt less like a celebration and more like a place where decisions about other people's lives quietly happened. I had barely taken 3 steps when one of the businessmen from the library noticed me again. Emily, he called with effortless familiarity. Several nearby guests turned toward us. I forced another polite smile. Good evening, sir. Come here for a second. His companions exchanged amused glances. I approached carefully, tray balanced against my shoulder. Yes, sir? We were just debating something. He leaned comfortably against the edge of the table. Tell us honestly. If someone offered you enough money to leave your job tonight, would you take it? A few people smiled as though waiting for entertainment. I answered without hesitation. No. He blinked. No? I made a commitment to finish my shift. Another guest laughed softly. That is admirable. The first man tilted his head. Even if the offer changed your life? A promise does not become less important because the price becomes larger. Silence settled over the table. The words had escaped before I could overthink them. They were simply true. My father used to say that character was what remained after opportunity knocked. He had been gone for 6 years, but I still carried that lesson with me. The businessman reached into his jacket and removed a thick envelope, placing it on the table between us. Think of it as appreciation for your honesty. I looked at the envelope without touching it. I cannot accept that. Why not? Because I did not earn it. His smile faded slightly. You are refusing a generous gift. Respectfully, yes. I slid the envelope gently back toward him. If you would like to support someone tonight, please increase your donation to the Children's Hospital. They will put it to much better use than I ever could. Around the table, conversation stopped completely. I became painfully aware that dozens of eyes were now watching us. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Had I just ruined my job? The businessman studied me for a long moment before slowly withdrawing the envelope. You really mean that? Yes, sir. Before another word could be spoken, an unmistakable silence spread through the room. It rolled outward like invisible ripples across a still lake. Every conversation paused. Every head subtly turned toward the entrance. I did not need to look to know who had arrived. Calm footsteps crossed the marble floor at an unhurried pace until they stopped somewhere just behind me. No one spoke. Then Adrian Romano's composed voice broke the silence with a single sentence delivered so naturally that it almost sounded like an ordinary observation. Miss Carter made the correct decision. I closed my eyes for the briefest moment. Somehow, without raising his voice, he had just ended a conversation that no one else in the room had possessed the authority to stop. No one challenged him. That surprised me more than his words. The businessman who had been smiling only seconds earlier simply nodded once and slipped the envelope back inside his jacket without the slightest complaint. Around the room, conversations resumed cautiously, but the atmosphere had changed again. It felt quieter now, as though every guest had been reminded that there were rules no one needed to explain aloud. I turned slowly until I faced Adrian Romano for the first time that evening without a tray or coffee pot between us. Up close, he looked less like the larger-than-life figure everyone whispered about and more like someone completely comfortable carrying responsibilities no one else could see. His blue-gray eyes met mine with the same calm expression they had held all night. There was no triumph in them. No arrogance. Only quiet certainty. Thank you, I said, because I could not think of anything else that made sense. He inclined his head slightly. You thanked the wrong person. I frowned. Excuse me? You protected your own principles. I merely acknowledged them. Before I could answer, one of the businessmen gave an awkward laugh. Mr. Romano, we were only having a little fun. Adrian shifted his attention toward him. His expression did not harden, yet something about the silence that followed carried more weight than raised voices ever could. I know, he replied evenly. The question is whether Miss Carter was enjoying it as much as you were. No one answered. They did not need to. Adrian looked back at me. Are you still working? The simplicity of the question caught me off guard. Yes. Then I should not keep you from your responsibilities. I offered a small nod. Thank you. As I reached for my tray, he added one more sentence. Your father would have approved of your answer. My fingers froze around the silver handle. Every sound in the room seemed to disappear. I stared at him before I could stop myself. How do you know about my father? He regarded me quietly for a moment. You quoted him without realizing it. I blinked. My father had said those words so many times while I was growing up that I had stopped recognizing them as his. Character was what remained after opportunity knocked. I had repeated the lesson naturally, never noticing its origin. A faint warmth touched Adrian's expression, almost too subtle to call a smile. Good advice usually survives the people who first speak it. I did not know how to respond. He stepped aside, creating space for me to leave, never once blocking my path. It was such a small gesture, but I noticed it immediately. Every powerful person I had served seemed accustomed to expecting others to move first. Adrian had moved instead. I carried the tray back toward the service station, trying to steady my breathing. Linda met me halfway with wide eyes. "Emily," she whispered, "what happened?" "Nothing." Even as I answered, I knew the word sounded impossible. "Nothing keeps happening," she murmured. I glanced over my shoulder. Adrian had already resumed speaking with the other guests as though the entire exchange had never occurred. The room slowly returned to its elegant rhythm. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Jazz drifted through the ballroom once again. Yet several people continued glancing in my direction before quickly looking away. I wanted nothing more than to disappear back into the comfortable anonymity that had protected me for years. Instead, I had somehow become the one person everyone suddenly seemed to notice. I had no idea why Adrian Romano had stepped into that conversation. I had no idea why he seemed to understand me after only a handful of words. But deep inside, beneath every logical explanation I tried to invent, a quiet instinct kept whispering the same unsettling truth. This evening was no longer unfolding by chance. The final hour of the gala passed more slowly than the first three combined. Every time I entered a room, conversation seemed to pause for a fraction of a second before continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining it, but even the other waiters noticed the difference. Marcus, who had worked banquets twice as long as I had, nudged my shoulder while we polished serving trays in the kitchen. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "Nothing. People do not get noticed by men like Romano for nothing." I shrugged. "I served coffee." He laughed once. "If serving coffee impressed people like that, I would own this hotel by now." Before I could answer, Linda walked into the service area carrying a clipboard. "Everyone, thank you for tonight. The ballroom closes in 15 minutes. Finish your stations and clock out." A collective sigh of relief spread through the room. Chairs were already being reset. Floral arrangements disappeared onto rolling carts. Musicians quietly packed away their instruments while the last guests lingered beneath the chandeliers. Midnight had finally arrived. I changed into my navy raincoat, tucked my employee badge into my purse, and stepped through the staff exit into the cool Manhattan night. The rain had softened into a gentle mist that coated the sidewalks in shimmering reflections. Taxi headlights stretched across the wet pavement while distant sirens blended into the familiar soundtrack of the city. I breathed deeply, grateful for the fresh air after hours beneath crystal lights and expensive perfume. Home was only 3 subway stops away. Oliver would probably be waiting by the apartment door, pretending he had not spent the evening sleeping on my favorite chair. The thought made me smile. I adjusted the strap of my bag and started walking toward Lexington Avenue. My shoes clicked softly against the damp sidewalk. The streets were quieter now, occupied mostly by late-night commuters and hotel staff finishing their shifts. Halfway down the block, I noticed a black sedan parked beneath a street lamp. It was elegant without trying to attract attention, the kind of car that blended into wealthy neighborhoods while costing more than my apartment building. I barely glanced at it before continuing toward the subway entrance. "Miss Carter." The voice stopped me before I reached the corner. I turned carefully. A man wearing a dark overcoat stood several yards away near the sedan. He looked to be in his early 40s with neatly trimmed gray hair and the composed posture of someone accustomed to responsibility. He did not step closer. He simply waited until I acknowledged him. "Yes? My name is Daniel Brooks. I work for Mr. Romano." Every instinct told me to remain cautious. "Can I help you?" "Actually, I believe he wishes to help you." I tightened my grip on my bag. "I appreciate that, but I am heading home." Daniel nodded politely, as though he had expected the answer. Of course. He anticipated that response as well. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a simple white business card. No gold lettering. No elaborate design. Only a name, a phone number, and an address printed in clean black ink. He held it out without moving closer. He asked me to give you this only after your shift ended, so there would be no misunderstanding. I accepted the card out of courtesy, nothing more. What is this for? If you ever decide you would like to discuss an opportunity, the address is there. What kind of opportunity? Daniel smiled with remarkable patience. One that cannot be explained properly on a sidewalk in the rain. I looked from the card to the waiting sedan. Please thank Mr. Romano, but I already have a job. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. Miss Carter, I do not believe this offer has anything to do with employment. Before I could ask another question, he gave a respectful nod, returned to the sedan, and the car disappeared quietly into the midnight traffic, leaving me standing beneath the street lamp with a rain-speckled business card in my hand and the growing realization that whatever had begun inside that ballroom had just followed me into the rest of my life. I slipped the business card into the inside pocket of my raincoat without looking at it again. Whatever opportunity Daniel Brooks had hinted at belonged to a world that had nothing to do with mine. I was an overworked architecture student who waited banquet tables on weekends. Men like Adrian Romano belonged on magazine covers and charity boards, not in the thoughts of someone calculating whether groceries or another textbook would fit into next week's budget. By the time I reached my apartment building on the Upper East Side, I had almost convinced myself the entire evening would become nothing more than a strange story to laugh about someday. Oliver greeted me exactly as expected, weaving around my ankles with theatrical complaints until I filled his food bowl. My apartment was barely 600 square feet, but after spending hours surrounded by polished marble and crystal chandeliers, the worn hardwood floors and mismatched furniture felt comforting. I changed into an oversized sweater, brewed chamomile tea, and opened my laptop, intending to review architectural sketches before bed. Instead, my thoughts kept drifting back to the ballroom. Adrian had never spoken more than a handful of sentences to me. Yet every one of them seemed carefully chosen, as though he disliked wasting words. I reached into my coat pocket and removed the white business card. There was nothing unusual about it. Adrian Romano. One phone number. One Manhattan address. No company logo. No title. No explanation. I almost laughed at myself before placing it inside the drawer of my desk and closing it firmly. Some doors were better left unopened. The next morning arrived far too quickly. Saturday sunlight filtered through my apartment windows while the steady rhythm of rain had finally disappeared. My schedule was ordinary again. Grocery shopping. Laundry. An afternoon shift helping organize decorations for a community fundraiser in Brooklyn. Ordinary sounded wonderful after the previous night. By noon I was carrying folding chairs across the recreation center gymnasium alongside volunteers from the neighborhood. Children raced between basketball hoops while local musicians tested microphones for the evening performance. Nobody cared what designer suit someone wore. Nobody whispered when a new guest entered the room. People smiled because they recognized one another, not because they hoped to gain something. I loved places like this. They reminded me that kindness rarely needed expensive lighting. Around 3 o'clock, I stepped outside to unload donated boxes of school supplies from a delivery van. As I carried 2 cartons toward the entrance, I noticed a silver sport utility vehicle parked across the street. It remained there for several minutes without anyone getting out. I told myself it was waiting for a parking space. Then it slowly drove away. An hour later, while I walked to the neighborhood coffee shop for bottled water, I saw the same vehicle again at the opposite end of the block. Coincidence, I thought. New York was full of identical cars. Still, an uneasy feeling settled quietly in my chest. I returned to the recreation center and forced myself to focus on arranging tables and greeting families arriving for the fundraiser. By early evening the parking lot overflowed with cars, children laughed beneath colorful balloons, and volunteers served barbecue from outdoor grills. Everything looked perfectly normal. I was carrying a box of art supplies toward the entrance when my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Something made me answer anyway. Hello? Daniel Brooks spoke with the same calm professionalism I remembered from the night before. Good evening, Miss Carter. I apologize for calling unexpectedly. I stopped walking. How did you get my number? Your employment records listed emergency contact information that included it. The answer should have bothered me more than it did. Before I could respond, his voice grew noticeably more serious. Please do not be alarmed, but I would like you to avoid leaving the recreation center alone this evening. My grip tightened around the phone. Why? There was a brief pause before he answered. Because Mr. Romano believes someone besides him noticed you at the gala, and he prefers not to gamble when another person's safety may be involved. Daniel ended the call before I could ask another question. I stood motionless beside the stack of donated school supplies, my phone still pressed against my ear long after the line had gone silent. Around me, life continued exactly as it had a minute earlier. Children laughed while chasing bubbles across the parking lot. Parents unfolded lawn chairs near the small outdoor stage. Someone tested the microphone with a cheerful greeting that echoed across the neighborhood. It all looked wonderfully ordinary, and perhaps that was what unsettled me the most. If Adrian Romano was wrong, then I was letting a stranger's warning invade a perfectly normal Saturday. If he was right, then I had absolutely no idea why. I slipped my phone into my pocket and forced myself back to work. Worry would not help anyone decorate tables. An hour passed without incident. Families filled the recreation center. Volunteers served hamburgers and lemonade while local high school students performed classic rock songs that had everyone clapping along. I almost forgot about Daniel's warning until I noticed Mrs. Henderson struggling to carry 3 folding tables by herself. She had to be nearly 70, but she insisted on helping every community event. Please let me, I said, hurrying over. She smiled warmly. You always appear exactly when someone needs an extra pair of hands. My father used to say helping early saves apologizing later. She laughed. Your father sounds like a wise man. I smiled quietly. He tried. Together we finished arranging the tables just as the evening raffle began. I finally allowed myself to relax. Maybe Adrian's concern had simply been unnecessary caution. Maybe powerful people worried differently than everyone else. As sunset painted the sky with shades of orange and violet, the fundraiser came to an end. Volunteers hugged goodbye, children carried home handmade crafts, and the parking lot slowly emptied. I helped load the remaining boxes into the storage room before collecting my backpack. Only a handful of cars remained. I reached the sidewalk and instinctively looked both directions. Nothing seemed unusual. No silver sport utility vehicle. No unfamiliar faces. I almost laughed at myself for being so nervous. Then a familiar black sedan pulled quietly alongside the curb. Daniel Brooks stepped out first. He did not hurry. He simply opened the rear passenger door before walking toward me with the same composed expression I remembered. Good evening, Miss Carter. I folded my arms instinctively. You certainly have impressive timing. I try. You really expected me to accept a ride from someone I barely know? No. His answer surprised me. Mr. Romano specifically instructed me not to pressure you. He dislikes forcing decisions. I studied him carefully. Then why are you here? Because he also instructed me not to leave until I personally confirmed you reached home safely. I stared at him in disbelief. Why would he care? Daniel was silent for a moment before answering. Because Mr. Romano takes responsibility for people once he believes they have become involved in matters connected to him. I am not involved in anything. That is precisely what he hopes remains true. Before I could reply, another familiar voice interrupted from behind us. Emily? I turned to see Marcus from the hotel walking toward the subway entrance carrying a backpack over one shoulder. Everything okay? He asked. I nodded quickly. Yes. Just talking. Marcus looked briefly toward Daniel and the waiting sedan before lowering his voice. Your ride? Not exactly. Daniel offered Marcus a polite nod. Good evening. Marcus returned the greeting but gave me a puzzled look that clearly promised questions later. After he disappeared down the subway stairs, Daniel spoke again. You see how easily people begin making assumptions? I sighed softly. You still have not answered my question. He looked toward the evening traffic before meeting my eyes once more. Miss Carter, Mr. Romano does not believe you are in danger because of who you are. He believes you may be in danger because someone else mistakenly believes you matter to him. And misunderstandings have a way of growing if they are ignored. I looked at Daniel for several long seconds, searching for any sign that this entire conversation was some elaborate misunderstanding. His expression never changed. Calm. Respectful. Patient. He stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years delivering difficult truths without raising his voice. I finally exhaled. I appreciate the concern, but I cannot build my life around assumptions. Daniel nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. Neither would Mr. Romano ask you to. Then what does he want? Daniel glanced toward the black sedan before answering. He would like 10 minutes of your time. Nothing more. I laughed softly, more from disbelief than amusement. You make that sound simple. It is. People like him do not ask for 10 minutes. He does. I looked toward the waiting car. Every sensible instinct warned me to walk toward the subway instead. Yet another part of me remembered the ballroom. Adrian had never once demanded anything. Every interaction had ended with a choice that remained mine to make. That difference mattered more than I wanted to admit. 10 minutes, I repeated. Then I go home. Daniel inclined his head. That is exactly what he instructed me to promise. A few minutes later the sedan pulled quietly beneath the covered entrance of an elegant brownstone overlooking a small private garden on the Upper East Side. It was not the towering mansion I had unconsciously imagined. No elaborate gates. No display of impossible luxury. The home looked refined but lived in, its warm lights glowing through tall windows as evening settled across the neighborhood. Daniel opened the front door and stepped aside. Mr. Romano is waiting in the library. The room smelled faintly of cedar, old books, and freshly brewed coffee. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, interrupted only by large windows overlooking the rain-dark garden. Architecture books occupied one entire section beside volumes on history, economics, and classical literature. A grand piano rested quietly near the fireplace. The house felt unexpectedly peaceful. Adrian stood near one of the windows holding a ceramic coffee mug instead of the crystal glass I would have expected. He turned as I entered. Miss Carter. Mr. Romano. He gestured toward a chair across from a small wooden table. Thank you for coming. Your assistant is very persuasive. A faint smile appeared. Daniel has been told that persuasion only works when people are free to refuse. I sat carefully. You said 10 minutes. I did. He placed his mug on the table before taking the opposite chair. There were no bodyguards inside the room. No interruptions. Only the quiet crackle of the fireplace. You have questions, he said. Several. Ask whichever one matters most. I studied him for a moment. Why me? He did not answer immediately. Instead he looked toward the shelves behind me, as though searching through memories instead of books. Because you did something very rare. I frowned. Served coffee? His eyes returned to mine. No. You repeatedly chose the difficult answer when easier ones were available. I waited silently. You protected a child without expecting recognition. You refused money you did not earn. You kept your promise to finish your shift. You defended your future without insulting anyone else's success. His voice remained calm, almost reflective. Most people believe character reveals itself during extraordinary moments. They are mistaken. Character reveals itself during ordinary ones that nobody expects to matter. I swallowed quietly. You noticed all of that? I notice people. Another silence settled between us, comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since the gala. Did you really invite me here because of those few moments? Adrian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No. He looked directly into my eyes with complete honesty. I invited you because for the first time in many years, I met someone whose principles could not be purchased, hurried, or frightened into changing. Those people are extraordinarily rare. When life places one in your path, ignoring them is a mistake I no longer intend to make. I lowered my eyes for a moment, letting his words settle into the silence between us. No one had ever described me that way before. Friends called me dependable. Professors called me hardworking. My father had simply called me stubborn with a smile that made the word sound like a compliment. Adrian Romano looked at the same ordinary decisions and somehow saw something much larger. I was not sure whether that comforted me or frightened me. You barely know me, I said quietly. That is true. Then how can you be so certain? He rested his hands loosely around the warm coffee mug before answering. Because people rarely become different when circumstances improve. They become more of what they already are. I thought about that for several seconds. It sounded like the kind of sentence someone earned rather than invented. You speak as though experience taught you that lesson. A faint shadow crossed his expression. It did. The room fell silent again. Outside, water still clung to the garden leaves from the previous night's rain, catching the soft glow of the landscape lights. Somewhere deeper inside the house, an old clock chimed once. I realized I had completely forgotten about the 10 minutes. Daniel said someone else may have noticed me, I finally said. Was that the real reason you wanted to see me? Adrian nodded once. Partly. Then tell me the rest. He stood and walked toward one of the bookshelves before removing a small framed photograph. Instead of handing it to me immediately, he studied it for a quiet moment. When he finally placed it on the table between us, I saw a younger Adrian standing beside an older man with silver hair. Both were smiling naturally, far differently than the carefully controlled expression he wore today. My grandfather, he said. He raised me after my parents died. I looked at the photograph again. The resemblance was unmistakable. He taught me that power has only one purpose. Adrian looked toward the fireplace as though hearing another voice instead of his own. To protect people who cannot protect themselves. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the frame. I believed I understood that lesson when I was young. Then success arrived. Responsibilities multiplied. Decisions became more complicated. He paused before continuing. One evening, many years ago, someone asked for my help. His voice remained steady, but the weight beneath it had changed. I believed there would be time tomorrow. My chest tightened. There was not. He never described what had happened, and somehow that omission carried more emotion than any detailed explanation could have. I did not ask for names. Some memories deserved privacy. Since then, he continued quietly, I have tried never to ignore the moment when my instincts tell me another person's path has crossed mine for a reason. His blue-gray eyes met mine again. When I watched you that evening, I remembered my grandfather's voice more clearly than I had in years. I struggled to find the right words. You are placing a great deal of meaning on a chance meeting. He smiled very slightly. Architects understand foundations better than most people. I blinked. How do you know I study architecture? Because after the gala, I confirmed that the woman who refused easy money was exactly who she claimed to be. There was no embarrassment in his admission, only honesty. Surprisingly, I appreciated that more than if he had pretended otherwise. You investigated me. Only enough to know whether my instincts deserved my attention. I leaned back in the chair, considering everything I had heard. And what exactly do your instincts say now? Adrian answered without hesitation. They say your future is far larger than the life you have convinced yourself is possible. They also say that if I remain silent and simply watch you walk away, I will spend years wondering why I ignored the opportunity to help someone who reminded me of the man who taught me how to become one. I remained silent for a long moment, listening to the quiet crackle of the fireplace while his words echoed somewhere deeper than logic. Everything about the evening had challenged the simple life I had carefully built. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part remembered every warning my father had ever given me about confusing admiration with obligation. I slowly stood and slipped my raincoat over my shoulders. Adrian rose as well, but he made no effort to stop me. That, somehow, made leaving even harder. I am grateful for your honesty, I said softly. And for your concern. He nodded once. You do not owe me gratitude. Maybe not. But I choose to give it. A faint smile appeared and disappeared almost immediately. I picked up my bag. I cannot accept help that changes who I am. He looked at me steadily. I would never ask you to. Maybe not intentionally. I took a slow breath. But people change when they begin depending on someone else's world instead of building their own. He listened without interrupting. Everything I have dreamed about, I continued, every drawing, every class, every late-night shift at the hotel, every dollar I have saved, they all belong to a future that I have earned one step at a time. If I skip those steps now because someone powerful offers me an easier road, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether I ever deserved the destination. The room became completely still. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at me. That sounds exactly like something your father would have taught you. It is exactly what he taught me. I smiled sadly. He believed shortcuts often become long detours. Adrian walked slowly toward the window overlooking the quiet garden. He was wiser than many people I have known. I joined him, leaving a respectful distance between us. Outside, tiny drops of water clung to the branches, reflecting the soft lights like scattered stars. You asked me for 10 minutes, I said. You gave me much more than that. Time is easier to replace than regret. His answer came almost as a whisper. I turned toward him. Then let me save you from one regret. He waited. Do not spend your life trying to fix every person you believe deserves a chance. His expression remained calm, but I noticed the slightest surprise in his eyes. Some people need protection, I continued. Others simply need someone to believe they can stand on their own. I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair. I want to be the second kind. Another quiet silence settled between us. Finally, Adrian gave a slow nod. You believe leaving tonight is the correct decision? I do. Even knowing I may not ask again? Especially because of that. For the first time since we had met, he laughed softly. It was brief, genuine, and unexpectedly warm. Daniel was right. I tilted my head. About what? He said you would probably walk away. Was he disappointed? No. Adrian's smile faded into quiet respect. He said if you stayed too easily, then I had chosen the wrong person to help. I could not help smiling in return. He seems to understand you well. He reminds me when my instincts need patience. Daniel appeared discreetly near the library entrance, waiting without speaking. Adrian glanced toward him before returning his attention to me. Daniel will take you home. I opened my mouth to refuse before realizing the gesture was no longer about persuasion. It was simply courtesy. All right, I answered. As we walked toward the front door together, neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Some conversations did not need more words. At the entrance, I reached for the doorknob before turning back one final time. Mr. Romano? Yes? Thank you for believing I have a future worth protecting. His answer came without hesitation. Miss Carter, I do not believe your future needs me. I simply believe the world will be better if nothing prevents you from reaching it. Daniel drove me home through quiet Manhattan streets washed clean by the night's fading rain. Neither of us spoke very much. The city outside the window looked different than it had only 24 hours earlier, not because the buildings had changed, but because I had. Sometimes life does not announce its turning points with fireworks or headlines. Sometimes it simply places one unexpected conversation in front of you and quietly waits to see whether you become the same person afterward. When the sedan stopped outside my apartment building, Daniel stepped out and opened the door before I could reach for the handle. "Thank you," I said. He smiled politely. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Carter." I hesitated before asking the question that had lingered in my mind since the gala. Has he always been like this? Daniel understood immediately whom I meant. He looked toward the empty street for a moment before answering. No. What changed? He smiled to himself, almost as though remembering someone else entirely. Life has a way of teaching difficult lessons to people who carry great responsibility. The fortunate ones learn compassion instead of fear. I nodded quietly. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Miss Carter. I climbed the familiar stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and found Oliver waiting exactly where he always waited, stretching lazily before demanding his late dinner as though nothing remarkable had happened. I laughed for the first time all weekend. His ordinary routine reminded me that not every part of life needed to change simply because one extraordinary moment had arrived. The following Monday morning, I returned to architecture class carrying the same worn sketchbook, the same backpack, and the same determination that had carried me through countless long nights before. During studio review, my professor paused longer than usual at one of my building designs. He looked up and smiled. "Emily, this is your strongest work yet." I thanked him, surprised by how calm I felt. Later that afternoon, an email arrived informing me that I had been selected for a competitive internship I had almost convinced myself was beyond my reach. I stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly closing my eyes. Nothing had been handed to me. Nothing had been purchased for me. I had earned it exactly the way I had always hoped I would. That evening, as I walked home beneath a golden sunset reflecting across the East River, my phone vibrated with a single message from an unfamiliar number. There were no grand speeches. No demands. No promises. Only one sentence. Congratulations on the internship. I suspected they would recognize what was already there. There was no signature. There did not need to be one. I smiled before slipping the phone back into my pocket without replying. Some people enter your life to change your direction. Others enter simply to remind you that your direction was already worth following. I never became part of Adrian Romano's world, and he never asked me to. Instead, we carried something far more valuable away from that remarkable weekend. I kept my independence. He kept his promise never to ignore the quiet voice that told him another human being mattered. People would probably hear fragments of our story and assume that an influential man had chosen an ordinary woman one rainy night in Manhattan. They would only know half the truth. What really happened was much simpler. A woman who refused to compromise her principles reminded a man surrounded by power why character had always mattered more than influence. Looking back now, I finally understand why that evening never left my memory. It was never about being chosen. It was about discovering that the greatest acts of strength are rarely loud. They appear in ordinary decisions, quiet kindness, promises kept, and the courage to walk your own path even when an easier one is waiting. In the end, neither wealth nor status changed either of us. Respect did. And sometimes, that is the kind of ending that changes every beginning which follows.